welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist, with Texas System of Care. This podcast is devoted towards how to work with specific populations within your local system of care community and ensure that you're providing services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. This series is focused on working with the Latino community. For a further explanation of CLC terminology, including terms used in this podcast, we recommend checking out the ABCs of CLC webinar series. Today we continue the conversation with Dr. Manuel Zamarripa, Professor of Counseling at South University in Round Rock, Texas. Dr. Zamarripa, thank you again for joining us to continue this conversation on working with the Latino community. Where we left off in the last episode, we were talking about different communication types and kind of contrasting between linear communication and circular. I was wondering if you have any specific examples you've seen where there's kind of a clash of those communication types in your work.
Yes. From the clients or from other providers?
Oh, both, I think.
Yeah. Well, connecting with that, but you're reminding me of one of the things that we talk a lot about. Well, two things. One is that the best way is to always take a both-and approach, which is when does the approach that we learn, maybe through formal schooling, the westernized way, right? When is that important? But also when are other forms of communication that we're going to talk about are important as well. So a lot of the times what we learn, very similar to the checklist kind of interview style, we do that because it's very important that we get correct information about what's happening to the client. And that's what drives that form of communication. And that's the way a lot of professionals are trained. And that's why it's hard to expand that view or to question that view because, we're assuming that all providers are definitely looking for the best interest of the client and they're in the profession because they care. So what some providers trained in this way hear when they say, wait a minute, you may be doing something that's not in the best interest of the clients, or wait a minute, just talk about approaching this a different way. What they may hear is, but I need to get this accurate information. Otherwise, how are we going to treat this client? What's really going on? And so the questions and the approaches are designed to try to find a way to dig and get to the most accurate information possible. That's one side. But the other side that we're talking about is the appropriateness of how you talk with clients and what you bring up that fits maybe more with certain cultural styles. That will get you the information, but it's about where you prioritize accurate communication versus appropriate communication, appropriate context. And they're both necessary, but a lot of the times you have to prioritize what's appropriate for you as a provider to say and not say, to ask and not ask, and what do the clients feel is appropriate for them to say and not say. Because going back to what we said before, if the client's operating from the notion that this is the provider and I'm just gonna not question him or her, it's more appropriate for that client to give the polite yes, and that's what they're gonna do because they value that. That's more important in the moment than saying, maybe what we would say is the more quote-unquote accurate answer, because what's hanging between the provider and the client in the context is, this is the professional, this is the authority, I'm here to help, and how you treat people is important and the respect you give to them is important. I am here to listen, to learn as the client. He or she will tell me what they think, and then that's my role, and I go home and I either know what they're talking about or I don't, or I try to implement it or I don't. So I think what we need to expand to is our role sitting in front or with the clients, and in this case a lot of Latino clients, and try to determine what's the most appropriate approach so that this client trusts me, so that this client knows that I'm interested in what he or she is talking about, so that this client knows that I am invested in their well-being. because sometimes going straight for the answers that we're trying to get, that hopefully, that go from the accuracy perspective, is driven from our fear of not missing something. Right. And as well placed as that is, that does nothing to, or can do very little to get some buy-ins, to get some trust, to communicate to the client that I am there because I am invested in your well-being, which is another clash of perspectives, because from that model, from the more Western model, people's roles are very well defined. So if I'm a patient and I'm going to see my physician, we talk a lot about bedside manner and physicians that may or may not have that very well, but our roles are well defined, and so I may assume that this person is in the profession because he or she wants to help. So we don't always expect necessarily a certain type of communication from the professional that they're invested in who we are. But if our world view, if our lens is distinct, then we may not, as clients, always make that assumption. And so some Latino clients may expect that the interaction is going to be different if this person really is invested in my well-being and wants that relationship to be different. There's a clear distinction between being personable and being informal. In our Western way of being, a lot of the times we confuse the two. Say, I really like that physician. He was really laid back, or she was really informal.
Chit-chatty.
Yeah, and so it didn't seem as stuffy, or didn't seem as... We combine two concepts without knowing. We combine informality with being personable. But for some Latino clients, that's a very clear distinction. They can expect and want that personalismo, right? But that doesn't mean they expect the professional to be informal. They realize it's still a formal relationship, but they're hoping that the interaction is personal and shows that the provider has an investment. And so that has to be made very clear. And again, not clear in the words that we use, like, I want you to know that I'm very invested in who you are. That could be helpful, but notice that I'm still going from the accurate communication.
Yeah.
I'm using the correct words to communicate. And if this person has a different worldview, then that may help a little bit, but it's going to matter more how you interact. If do you put aside the checklist but ask the questions, in a different way by just, tell me a little bit about what brought you here, and who recommended you come here, and so gathering the information, but also showing through the interaction that you're invested. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to take longer, but it's more about the approach.
Sure. Would it be appropriate in your mind for a provider, let's say that they do have checklists that they're mandated to have, filled out.
Right.
Is it appropriate for them to kind of, set that aside for a minute, have a conversation with the client, get the client's perspective on what's going on, and, where they believe issues are coming from, what they believe might be able to help, what they've tried. And then at the end, the provider can kind of do a quick run through and explain to the client, I'm looking at a piece of paper that I have to fill out. Some of the things have come up, but do you mind if I ask you a few pretty straightforward questions? Is that an appropriate approach?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an option. You can also do it at the very beginning and weave it through as well. You can be upfront and with the client and say whatever you're going to say in your introductions and in meeting the client, and just be explicit. Well, we're going to be talking through what got you here. I have this list. You can show them what's on the clipboard or whatever you have. So before we finish today, we're going to have to go through some of this, but I really want to know what it's been like for you, and in that way the client will know why the provider is going back and forth with the checklist if possible. A lot of the times it doesn't have to be sequential. Sometimes, there are some questions that do, but if you're going to be more interactive and you're explicit up front, then it allows for the client to be more genuine. And it also allows the client to know if you're not going in the order of the questions, why you kind of checking back and forth. Because if you're getting information that's out of sequence, then the client will know that you're paying attention. You're not just going back and forth because you're bored or you're not listening. And so trying to make it as collaborative as possible.
Absolutely. And I think I've heard you say before that, the system was not set up, the mental health system at large was really not set up to serve all populations. I mean, if we're blunt about it, there was one specific population in mind, and some pieces of that works well across, all humans, and other pieces are very much cultural. So do you have any advice for providers who are in a work situation where they are mandated to, do billable services a certain way and fill out certain forms that they may find it difficult, to utilize that approach and still build rapport and really, show that they do genuinely care for the client and for their situation? Have you found, some specific, tricks or just kind of frameworks that kind of help smooth that transition and help you be a kind of a cultural broker between the system and the client?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is important is the notion that we just talked about in terms of being upfront as soon as possible with the clients about your intent that you care for them, where they're at, and what needs to happen in this 45 minutes so that those clients and other clients can continue to receive services. Right? What it does is it puts the client and the provider on the same team. Yeah. Not necessarily against the system, but a same team, knowing that we think this is really important. If they're there for an initial intake and then they're going to be referred, or if they're for an intake to continue with services there, then we want to say that we really want you to be able to access these services. This is one of the things that we need to do, and kind of upfront lay out the things that need to happen. Yeah. That one piece is important. I think another piece important in the conversation is always accentuating while you're getting the information, always accentuating what the client may already be doing, even in small ways, that is already in line with whatever treatment's going to be recommended. So if you notice, one of the things that he or she does is take walks, leave the house if they're feeling anxious, or, for example, if anxiety is an issue, then you just accentuate that instead of let that go unsaid, or just say, oh, okay, and then in your mind you're thinking, oh, that's a good thing. You accentuate that. It helps develop the rapport. It doesn't really add anything to the time. It may keep the client more invested. And another thing is always talking a little bit about where they want things to be in the next step of their life. Because you're not actually, this already sounds like, oh, they're in treatment already. This is kind of the therapeutic process. But we're talking about what you said. How do we combine the constraints that some providers have with showing trust and investment? And sometimes you can weave both. I remember some therapists saying, I can always build rapport while I'm asking questions. A lot of the times we'll say, well, let's spend some time building rapport, and then we'll get into some questions, right? Well, you can do both. Right. And so some of the things of, well, where would you want to see yourself when this is all done? Okay, that sounds, acknowledging that. Or where would you want to be, in a week from? Just a few things that, all of those things are about showing investment in who the client is, and it also highlights their competency, and it also highlights some of their agency while you're still gathering the information you need to gather. So it's the skill of always paying attention to what the client is giving back to us, and anytime they're giving back anything to us that already seems in line of what they may want to be doing, or something they've done in the past, or anything we're hearing, that we accentuate that. And it's a good example because that has nothing to do with kind of tricks, I guess, around like shortening the questions or,
Yeah.
right? They may seem like they're not connected at all, but it's very connected because you're dealing with the appropriateness of the context. You're trying to get some buy-in, some trust, and you're also dealing with the information you need to gather. And that could be some helpful kind of shifts.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that, providers are so trained to kind of categorize everything. My rapport is over here, my rapport building is over here, my chit-chat is over here. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can be all throughout the exchange, that you're building up that rapport. And I also appreciate so much what you said about being a team, working together, to try to find solutions together. I think that's absolutely spot on. And kind of getting back again to what you said before about the difference between informality and showing genuine care. There's a big difference between in the beginning of an interaction taking a couple minutes to talk about the weather, and chit chat, and at the end, if you are unsure whether your client has if you're a counselor suggesting that they make an appointment with the psychiatrist, if you're not sure that they know how to go about doing that, taking the time to, as a team, work together, and if you have that lens of this is my teammate, we're going to work through this together, then you'll kind of have your radar up for what are other ways that I can assist. And in assisting and, providing support that way, you're at the same time building rapport. It's not over here, I'm talking about the weather and asking how their kiddos are doing. I'm asking them about their children because that is very important. Or I'm asking this youth about how things are going with their parents or at school, not for chit-chat, rapport building in a box, but because it is all related, it's all linked. I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast on working with the Latino community. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.